You're back earlier than I thought.
What? I hadn't been here!
The plan was simple. Spend a quiet weekend off the grid at a cabin in northern Minnesota. I had rented the place online, hoping the isolation would give me the peace I needed to clear my head. It was advertised as rustic but cozy, a perfect getaway nestled deep in the woods, with no phone reception or neighbors for miles. Exactly what I needed, or so I thought. The cabin stood at the end of a narrow, overgrown trail, hidden by a thick wall of pine trees. The place was smaller than it had looked in the pictures. The heavy silence of the forest around it was exactly what I had been hoping for. It felt remote, comforting at first, until it wasn't. By the time I arrived, the sun was already slipping behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the porch. The air smelled sharp and clean, but it was cold, the kind of cold that made you feel like the forest was pressing closer. The lock on the front door was old and rusted, and it took several tries before it gave with a reluctant click. When the door finally swung open, the air inside was thick with the scent of stale wood and old dust. The first thing I noticed was the furniture, too much of it for such a small place. The main room was cluttered with mismatched chairs and side tables, all pushed against the walls as if someone had tried to make space but had nowhere to store the excess. A tattered couch sat under the window, its cushions sunken and torn. It felt as though someone had lived here for years, but left in a hurry, taking nothing with them. I told myself it was just an old rental, nothing out of the ordinary. These kinds of places always felt a little strange, caught somewhere between use and abandonment. I dropped my bag near the door and flicked on the single overhead light. It buzzed for a second, casting a dim yellow glow across the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I closed the door behind me, locking it with a satisfying click. That's when I noticed it, the smell. Not the dusty, wooden smell I had noticed before, but something else, heavier and damp, like wet clothes left to mildew. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the old furniture. But the unease settled deep in my bones, hard to shake. I explored the rest of the cabin, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. The kitchen was cramped and dark, with outdated appliances that looked like they hadn't worked in years. A single hallway led to a tiny bathroom and a bedroom at the back. There was nothing unusual about the place. No signs of anyone else, nothing out of place. But the smell followed me wherever I went, clinging to the air. It felt like a presence, thick and unavoidable. I opened a window in the bedroom, hoping the cold night air would clear it out, but the feeling only grew worse, gnawing at the edges of my nerves. As night fell, the forest outside became an impenetrable wall of darkness. No sounds, no wind, no animals, just silence so deep it felt unnatural. I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing the back of my neck, trying to shake off the anxiety that had settled in my chest. The mattress sagged beneath me, as though someone much heavier had slept there for too long. Then I saw it, a set of wet footprints leading from the front door to the middle of the room. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. My heart pounded against my ribcage. I followed them with my eyes, unable to move, my skin crawling with the realization that they weren't mine. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the rug. I stared at the dark stains spreading across the fabric, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could someone have come in without me hearing? I had locked the door. I knew I had. But the evidence was there, soaked into the floor. Someone had been inside. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. Every instinct screamed to leave, to get out while I still could. But I couldn't bring myself to move. I stared at the door, willing it to stay shut, terrified it might swing open at any moment. Then the light above me flickered. Once, twice, and then darkness. The cabin plunged into silence, heavier than before. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but there was no signal, no light, just the black void pressing in from all sides. I stood frozen, the cold seeping into my skin, the scent of mildew thick in the air. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate breath coming from the corner of the room. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was there, standing just out of sight, waiting. I backed toward the door, my heart slamming in my chest. My hand found the cold metal of the doorknob, twisting it frantically. It didn't budge. I yanked harder, panic setting in, but the lock held firm. Then, the soft sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, moving closer. The breath was right behind me now, hot and damp against the back of my neck. I don't remember unlocking the door. All I remember is the cold night air hitting my face as I stumbled outside, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran, not daring to look back. The forest swallowed me whole, the sound of my own footsteps drowned out by the pounding of my heart. When I finally reached the car, I threw myself inside, locking the doors with trembling hands. My breath came in ragged gasps, my skin cold with fear. I stared at the cabin through the windshield, waiting to see movement at the windows. But there was nothing, only the dark, empty house, standing still in the cold night. I never went back to retrieve my things. I didn't need to. Whatever I left behind in that cabin could stay there. I knew I wasn't welcome.
Subscribe. It cannot be that. It is him again.
The highway seemed endless, a narrow strip of asphalt stretching across the barren plains of West Texas. The sun had already set, and the darkness crept in like a rising tide. I'd been driving for hours, my body aching from sitting too long. There was no music, no radio, just the steady hum of the engine and the low thump of the tires against the uneven road. Silence weighed heavy in the car, thick and oppressive. It was one of those nights where the emptiness of the road felt unnatural, like the world had folded in on itself. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that gnaws at the edges of your nerves, making you hyper-aware of every little movement, every sound. I had 2 more hours to go before I'd be home, but each mile felt longer than the last. As I crossed a narrow bridge, something caught my eye, a figure standing by the side of the road. A man, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. He raised one arm slowly, a thumb pointed toward the sky. There were no cars behind me, no towns nearby, just this lone figure in the middle of nowhere. I kept driving, instinct guiding me not to stop. There was no reason anyone should be out here this late, and the way he stood, too still, made my skin prickle. The rear-view mirror showed his shrinking silhouette, motionless as my car sped away. Something about the way he stood, the casual posture, the lack of urgency, unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. The highway ahead stretched into the dark, and the tension in my chest grew with every mile. It felt like the night itself was watching me, pressing against the windows of the car. I adjusted the mirror, glancing back out of habit. The road behind me was empty, just darkness stretching as far as I could see. Then a shape emerged in the distance, another figure by the roadside. At first, I thought it was a different person, but as my headlights hit him, my stomach dropped. It was the same man, the hood, the stance, the way his hand lazily hovered at his side. It was impossible. I had left him miles behind. Yet here he was, standing as if waiting for me again. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and a cold sweat began to form on the back of my neck. This had to be a trick, some strange coincidence. Maybe he had a twin, or maybe I had simply imagined the first one. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, but the knot of fear settled deeper in my gut. I kept driving, faster this time, watching the figure disappear into the darkness behind me. Every time I thought I had put enough distance between us, the doubt crept back in, clawing at my thoughts. What if it wasn't a coincidence? What if he wasn't just another traveler on the road? The miles blurred together, the landscape outside the window becoming indistinguishable shadows. It was as if the road itself had turned against me, stretching longer than it should. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It hadn't changed, 1:22 a.m. The hands seemed frozen, refusing to move forward, as though time had stalled somewhere along the highway. Another curve in the road, another mile marker, and then he was there again. This time, the hitchhiker was closer to the shoulder, his hood obscuring his face completely. I felt the blood drain from my face. He stood exactly as he had before, the same lazy stance, as though no time had passed since I last saw him. The fear hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to stop, to turn around, to leave this road behind, but there was nowhere to go. The highway stretched ahead, unforgiving, with no signs of life for miles. I couldn't understand how he kept appearing. The car felt suffocating now, the air heavy and stale. Every sound, the hum of the engine, the whine of the tires, seemed too loud, too intrusive. I forced my hands to stay steady on the wheel, but the panic bubbling in my chest made it hard to focus. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the speedometer creeping past the limit. The engine roared beneath me, but it didn't feel fast enough. I needed to get off this road. I needed to escape, but every mile felt like I was getting further from safety. Up ahead, a sign loomed out of the darkness. Rest area, 2 miles. Relief flooded my chest. I just needed to pull over, catch my breath, and get my bearings. Maybe I was imagining it all. Just a trick of the mind, born from exhaustion and isolation. I took the exit, the car jerking slightly as I pulled into the empty rest stop. The parking lot was deserted, lit only by a single flickering streetlight. I killed the engine and sat in the silence, my heart still racing. The relief I expected didn't come. The air felt too thick, like the night was waiting just outside the car windows. I checked the mirrors again. The highway behind me was empty. The knot in my chest loosened slightly, but the feeling of unease remained, lingering at the edge of my awareness. I told myself I just needed to rest for a few minutes, enough to clear my head before finishing the drive. I leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly. Then I saw him, standing at the edge of the parking lot, just under the flickering light. The hood was still pulled low over his face, but I knew it was him. The same figure waiting. He didn't move. He didn't come closer. He just stood there, as if he had been waiting for me all along. The air in the car felt suffocating again, and my chest tightened. I knew, without a doubt, that if I stayed a moment longer, he would move closer. The key slipped into the ignition with a metallic click, and I turned it hard, the engine roaring to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching against the gravel as I sped out of the rest stop. I didn't look back. The road ahead stretched into darkness, but the fear stayed with me. No matter how far I drove, I knew he would be waiting, somewhere further down the road. It was late October when we decided to take a weekend trip to Kettleford, an old logging settlement abandoned for decades. The place wasn't on most maps anymore, tucked away deep in the forested hills of Western Oregon. Will was the one who pushed for it. He had a thing for strange, forgotten places, the kind of towns that were more myth than memory. He said it would be fun. I wasn't so sure. The idea of trekking through a ghost town felt more unsettling than adventurous. But it was supposed to be just a hike, just a distraction from the city's noise, the relentless hum of daily life. Emily, my wife, saw it as a chance to collect mushrooms for one of her recipes. Will's girlfriend, Grace, came along to keep him entertained. And me? I just wanted to get through the weekend without anything weird happening. The trail was long and winding, the dense forest swallowing us whole. Everything felt too quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept telling myself it was just a hike, that there was nothing to worry about, but the unease in my chest grew heavier with every step. When we reached Kettleford, the fog was already rolling in, thick and white, blurring the edges of the crumbling buildings. It looked like the forest had reclaimed the town, vines creeping through broken windows, trees sprouting where homes once stood. The place was more ruin than village, and yet it felt like we were being watched. We followed the main path toward what remained of the town square. A few toppled signs, the cracked foundation of a post office, and an old chapel still standing, the steeple tilting dangerously to one side. Emily was already picking through the undergrowth, searching for mushrooms. Will, of course, headed straight for the church, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. "Look at this," he said, standing by a weathered stone near the entrance. It jutted out of the ground at an odd angle, smooth and black as obsidian. "Ever heard of a wishing stone?" he asked, tracing its surface. "They say people used to touch it for good luck, but after the town was abandoned, no one dared go near it. They say it changes things." Grace rolled her eyes, but Emily stepped forward, curious as always. Her fingers brushed the stone, and something shifted in the air. That's when the frogs began croaking, loud, sharp, and dissonant, like they were warning us to leave. The noise seemed to rise from every corner of the forest, filling the air with an unsettling urgency. Will laughed it off, but the sound gnawed at my nerves. I forced myself to look away from the stone and toward the church's window, just visible through the swirling mist. For a moment, I saw a shadow inside, a figure standing perfectly still watching us. When I blinked, the figure was gone. The silence after the frogs stopped felt heavier than any noise. Emily and Grace continued chatting, oblivious, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I wanted to leave. We moved deeper into the cemetery behind the church. Emily found a cluster of mushrooms near an old headstone, her excitement cutting through the tension in the air. I tried to focus on her, on the simplicity of the moment, but the mist thickened around us, erasing the trail we had come from. It was as if the fog was closing in, trapping us inside the town. The others wandered ahead, leaving me behind. The forest pressed closer with every step, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was wrong. The stone, the fog, the figure in the window. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something. The church door, warped and weathered by time, was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that before. A shiver ran down my spine. I glanced around, expecting to see Will or Grace nearby, but they were nowhere in sight. A soft breath brushed against my ear, not mine. The weight of it settled on my skin like a warning. Emily was still bent over the mushrooms, oblivious. I touched her shoulder, and she jumped, startled. Her eyes mirrored my fear. We needed to leave. Now. We moved quickly through the fog, back toward the road, but the ruins blurred around us, distorting into unfamiliar shapes. Every step felt wrong, as if we were walking deeper into something we couldn't escape. The sound of frogs rose again, louder this time, their croaks piercing through the mist like a signal. We reached the car, stumbling over the uneven ground. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, the lock clicking open with an echo that seemed too loud. I slid into the passenger seat, my chest tight, my breath uneven. Just as she started the engine, I glanced back through the mist, hoping, desperately, that I would see Will and Grace following us. Instead, a figure stood at the edge of the fog. It held something in its hands, a wicker basket filled with mushrooms. The same mushrooms Emily had picked. My stomach churned. There was no way anyone else could have taken them from her, not without us noticing. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by my confusion, and then it smiled. The house wasn't perfect, but it was affordable and tucked away in a quiet part of town, just what I had been looking for. The paint on the walls was chipped, the floors creaked with every step, and the windows fogged up too easily. But it was mine, a new beginning, a space to finally call my own. At first, it was peaceful. The hum of traffic was distant enough to be comforting, and the old radiators clanged occasionally, filling the house with a kind of lived-in warmth. Everything felt ordinary, settled. But that changed the day I discovered the hatch in the hallway floor. It was hidden under a worn rug, blending perfectly with the old wooden boards. If I hadn't been cleaning, I might never have noticed it. The edges of the hatch were smooth, almost seamless, with a rusted metal ring sunk into the wood. It looked old, like it hadn't been opened in years. There was no mention of it in the paperwork when I bought the house. Curiosity got the better of me. The moment I lifted the rug, the air seemed to shift, growing heavier, colder. I knelt down, hooked my fingers through the metal ring, and pulled. The hatch groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow, unfinished space beneath the house. It wasn't deep, just a small crawl space lined with dusty concrete. The kind of place that shouldn't matter, but it did. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the typical dampness of old wood and dirt. It was heavier, sour, like something left to rot. I squinted into the darkness, expecting to see insulation or forgotten junk. But there was nothing, just the bare concrete walls and a dark corner I couldn't quite make out. A strange chill ran through me, and I closed the hatch, trying to convince myself it was just a normal part of an old house. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, that every old house had its quirks. But from that moment on, the house didn't feel quite right. It was subtle at first, small things I tried to dismiss. The occasional sound like someone moving just out of sight. The way the floorboards seemed to creak more at night, even when I wasn't walking on them. The feeling that the air inside was growing heavier, thick enough to weigh down my thoughts. A week passed, and I started hearing noises from beneath the floor, soft, deliberate sounds. At first, it was faint like a rustling, as if something was shifting in the crawl space. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the old pipes or the house settling. But the sounds grew louder with each passing night. I stopped sleeping well. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to the sensation that something was moving just below my bed, separated from me by only a few inches of wooden planks. The noises became more distinct, a soft scraping, followed by moments of absolute silence, as if whatever was down there was waiting for me to react. I avoided the hatch after that, pushing furniture over the rug to keep it hidden, but the sounds didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to follow me, creeping from room to room. No matter where I was, I could feel something just beneath the surface, listening, watching. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, certain I had heard movement again, closer this time. I sat up in bed, my pulse thudding in my ears. The house was dead silent, but the silence was too deliberate, too thick, as if something was holding its breath just beneath me. The urge to check the hatch clawed at me, even though every instinct told me not to. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, hands shaking, and made my way down the dark hallway to the spot where the hatch was buried under the rug and furniture. When I slid the furniture away and lifted the rug, the air seemed colder, heavier than before. I knelt down and pulled on the ring, forcing the hatch open again. The flashlight beam wobbled as I aimed it into the crawl space. Something had changed. The dark corner that had been empty before now contained something. A small, crumpled blanket. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The smell was stronger now, sickly and stale. And then beneath the blanket I saw it. A shape, small and unmoving, too small to be anything good. The blanket shifted slightly, as if something underneath had been disturbed by the light. A wave of nausea hit me, and I stumbled backward, slamming the hatch shut. I felt the wood shift beneath me, almost as if the floor itself had shifted in response. I shoved the furniture back over the hatch, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. My skin felt clammy, my thoughts swirling in a haze of panic and disbelief. I didn't know what I had seen, or if I had seen anything at all, but the weight of it pressed down on me, too heavy to dismiss. The house grew quieter after that, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that felt like a warning, like something was waiting beneath the surface, patient and still. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Every shift in the air felt like the beginning of something I couldn't stop. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer, not with the crawl space and whatever was hiding beneath the blanket. The next morning, I packed what I could and left without looking back. I told myself it was just an old house with strange noises and quirks, but the memory of the hatch stayed with me, heavy as the air that had filled the crawl space. Sometimes late at night, I catch myself thinking about it. The shape beneath the blanket, the strange smell, the way the sounds followed me. I try not to imagine what might have been under there, but part of me knows. It's still waiting.
Subscribe.
The new apartment felt like a fresh start. A small, quiet place tucked away on the third floor of an older building. It was nothing special, just enough for me and my things. The view from the balcony overlooked the neighboring buildings, narrow streets, and alleys below. It was the kind of place that let you disappear for a while, unnoticed by the world. That was what I liked about it at first. The first few days passed without incident. I spent my time unpacking and arranging furniture, enjoying the solitude that came with being in a new place. But there was a window directly across from mine, in the building opposite, that I couldn't stop noticing. It sat dark and empty most of the time, with the curtains drawn back just enough to leave the glass exposed. It felt like a black hole, waiting to be filled. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just another window in another building. But the more I tried not to look at it, the harder it became to resist. Every time I passed by my own window, my eyes would drift toward it. Something about it demanded attention. One evening, I caught myself staring at it longer than I should have. The curtains hadn't moved, and the window remained lifeless. Yet the silence between us felt deliberate, as if someone was waiting. The thought made my skin prickle, but I brushed it off. There was no reason for it to bother me. Then, a few nights later, I saw movement. It was subtle, just the slightest shift, like someone brushing past on the other side of the glass. My heart skipped. The figure didn't stay long, vanishing deeper into the shadows of the apartment across the way. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a neighbor passing by. But the unease settled in, clawing at the edges of my thoughts. From that moment on, I became aware of every passing second that the window remained empty. The possibility of seeing someone there began to weigh on me. I found myself glancing at it more often, waiting for something to happen, though I didn't know what. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a push that never came. Then one night I saw them again, a figure standing just behind the glass. They were still, perfectly still, as if they were staring directly into my apartment. The darkness behind them made it impossible to make out any features, just a vague outline against the dim glow of the streetlights. They didn't move, and neither did I. It was as if time had stopped, trapping us both in that moment. I closed the blinds after that, hoping to block out the window and everything beyond it. But the presence lingered in my mind, stubborn and persistent. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the apartment made me think of that figure standing silently across the way, watching. The next morning, I forced myself to forget about it. It was just a neighbor, nothing more. People look out their windows all the time, especially at night. There was nothing strange about it. But that night, when I returned home from work, I hesitated before pulling back the blinds. The window across from mine was empty again. Yet the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Over the following nights, things grew worse. I couldn't explain it, but I felt them watching, even when the window was empty. It was a constant, suffocating awareness that clung to me no matter where I went in the apartment. I started double-checking the locks on the doors, making sure the windows were shut tight. But it didn't help. Then came the night the blinds were pulled open. It was late, and the building across from mine was bathed in the pale, orange glow of the streetlights. The curtains that had always been slightly drawn were now wide open. The window stood completely exposed, as if inviting me to look. And there they were. The figures stood motionless in the window, closer now, as if they had pressed themselves against the glass. My breath hitched. I could feel the weight of their stare even from across the alley. The air in my apartment seemed to thicken, trapping me in place. I wanted to move, to turn away, but I couldn't. It was as if the figure had pinned me there, holding me with the intensity of their gaze. The lights in their apartment flickered, casting the room behind them in brief flashes. Each burst of light revealed nothing but the figure, still and silent, pressed against the glass. And then the lights went out, plunging the window back into darkness. I closed my blinds again, heart racing. The silence in my apartment became unbearable, pressing in on me from every direction. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, not with the window still there, not with the figure waiting just beyond the glass. Morning couldn't come fast enough, but the fear lingered long after the sun rose. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a neighbor, acting strange for reasons I would never understand. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. When I left for work that morning, I glanced up at the window one last time. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, as if they had never been opened at all. I moved out of that apartment a week later. I didn't tell anyone why. How could I? It was just a window, just a neighbor, just a feeling that gnawed away at me night after night. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of that figure pressed against the glass, watching. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I still catch myself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see them standing there, still and waiting, just like before. It started with small things I could dismiss at first. A light left on that I was sure I had turned off, a drawer left slightly open in the kitchen, or a chair that seemed a little off-center from where I remembered placing it. I didn't think much of it in the beginning. It was easy to blame myself, tired from long work days, forgetting little things. That's what I told myself. But as the days went on, the feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger. The air inside my apartment felt different, heavier somehow, as if I wasn't entirely alone. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but that nagging sensation settled under my skin, making it hard to relax. I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just an old apartment. Things creaked, pipes clanged, and the mind plays tricks when you're overtired. Then came the morning I couldn't explain. I woke up and noticed my front door wasn't locked. I never forget to lock the door. It's a habit, something I do without thinking, especially living in a building where anyone could come and go. But that morning, the bolt was undone, and the latch wasn't turned. A cold weight settled in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was too tired the night before. Maybe I hadn't checked it properly. Maybe nothing. I locked the door again, double-checking it this time, and told myself it wouldn't happen again. But the unease stayed with me, creeping into every corner of the apartment. After that, I started paying closer attention. Every sound in the night made me sit up in bed, heart racing, as I strained to listen for anything unusual. I tried not to panic, but the feeling that someone else had been in my space was impossible to shake. The signs became harder to ignore. A pair of socks I didn't recognize folded neatly in the laundry basket. A cereal box I hadn't opened, sitting on the counter as if someone had just poured themselves a bowl. Things too specific to dismiss as accidents. Every time I tried to reason with myself, the excuses felt thinner and thinner. Then came the worst night. I woke up to the sound of a door softly clicking shut. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a loud slam, just the soft, deliberate sound of a latch sliding into place. Someone had closed the door inside my apartment. I sat up slowly, every muscle tensed, my ears straining in the dark. The room felt colder, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones and makes it hard to think. I could hear nothing else, just the deafening silence pressing in from every direction. For a long moment, I sat frozen, hoping I had imagined it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence felt alive. After what felt like hours, I slid my feet off the bed as quietly as I could, careful not to make a sound. The floor creaked beneath me, and the tiny noise felt like a gunshot in the dark. My mind raced through every possibility, every horrible scenario, but all I knew for sure was that someone was here. I moved toward the bedroom door, barely daring to breathe. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and unfamiliar in the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the windows. The apartment felt different, smaller somehow, like the walls had closed in overnight. I knew I had to check the front door. If it was unlocked, it meant someone had been inside and left. If it was still locked, it meant they were still here. The thought made my chest tighten. I took slow steps, each one feeling heavier than the last, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The air felt thicker, pressing down on me as I reached the front door. My hand hovered over the lock for a second, and I forced myself to check it. It was locked. The weight of that realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. Whoever had been inside was still here. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Every creak in the floor, every shift of air felt amplified. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It wasn't a large apartment, and whoever was inside knew it as well as I did. I stepped backward, retreating toward the bedroom, my hands trembling. The sound of my own footsteps seemed deafening in the quiet. Then, just as I reached the doorframe, I heard it, a soft, deliberate exhale. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just there, closer than I had expected. I didn't wait. I bolted into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it in one smooth motion. The thin wood between us felt like paper. My chest tightened, panic setting in as I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound from the other side. Silence. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that feels calculated, as if the other person knew exactly how to stay out of reach. I stood there breathless, waiting for something, anything, but nothing came. The rest of the night passed in agonizing stillness. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, gripping the phone in my hand, but too afraid to call anyone. Who would I even call? What would I say? When the sun finally rose, I left the apartment without looking back. I didn't take anything with me. I didn't care. I knew I couldn't stay another second in that place. I never found out how they got in, and I didn't want to. I moved to a new building across town, somewhere with better locks and fewer shadows. But the memory of that exhale still lingers, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Every creak in the night makes my heart race, and every shadow feels like a warning. Because deep down, I know they were never caught. It started with a missed bus. I had stayed too late at a friend's house, and by the time I reached the stop, the last bus of the night was long gone. The station was empty, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of distant traffic. The cold settled deep in my bones as I stood there, weighing my options. The next bus wouldn't come until morning, and there were no taxis in sight. Walking home wasn't ideal, but it wasn't far, just under 3 miles along a route I had taken dozens of times. The streets were familiar enough, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. I convinced myself it would be fine, just a brisk walk through empty neighborhoods. At first, the walk felt uneventful. The night was still, the streetlights casting long shadows that stretched across the sidewalks. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, and the sound of my footsteps echoed softly as I made my way past rows of dark houses. Every porch light was off, every window dark, just a town gone to sleep. Halfway home, I took a shortcut through a narrow alley that cut between 2 residential streets. I had used it plenty of times during the day, but at night, it felt different, tighter, quieter, as though the walls had crept closer together. The only sound was the rhythmic tap of my shoes against the pavement. Then I heard the second set of footsteps. They were faint, just a soft shuffle behind me, barely audible over my own steps. I stopped walking, heart pounding in my chest, and strained to listen. The night pressed in around me, thick with silence. But there was nothing, just the breeze rustling through the trees above. I told myself I had imagined it. The mind plays tricks in the dark, especially when you're tired. I adjusted my scarf and kept walking, quickening my pace slightly. But after a few moments, I heard them again. The same faint, deliberate steps trailing just behind me, matching my rhythm too perfectly to be a coincidence. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself not to look back, afraid of what I might see. Instead, I sped up, hoping that whoever was behind me would take the hint and go the other way. The alley stretched longer than I remembered, the streetlights spaced too far apart, leaving wide pools of shadow between each one. Every dark corner felt like it could hide something, or someone. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing louder now as I approached the end of the alley. The sound of the second set of steps didn't waver, didn't falter. They stayed just close enough to make it clear I wasn't imagining them. When I finally reached the main road, I crossed without hesitation, barely checking for traffic. The open street felt safer somehow, less suffocating. But the footsteps followed, steady and patient. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry, and that terrified me more than if they had been running. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, out walking or a light in a window. But the street was deserted. Nothing but rows of darkened houses with closed blinds and locked doors. The kind of night where no one notices anything. I try to focus on getting home. Just 2 more turns, and I'd be back on my street. I told myself I was overreacting. There were lots of reasons someone might be walking in the same direction. Maybe they lived nearby. Maybe they were just taking a late-night stroll. But that didn't explain the way they stayed, just out of sight, their footsteps perfectly in sync with mine. I turned the corner, feeling my pulse quicken as my apartment building came into view at the end of the street. The warm glow of the lobby light felt like a lifeline. I could almost hear the door clicking shut behind me, locking the night out for good. But then the footsteps stopped. It took me a moment to register the silence. The sudden absence of sound hit me like a wave, making my breath catch. I turned around, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see someone standing at the corner, watching me from the shadows. The street was empty. The knot of fear in my stomach twisted tighter. Whoever had been following me was gone, but not in a way that felt reassuring. It was as if they had simply slipped into the night, vanishing without a trace. I forced myself to walk the remaining distance to my building, trying to shake off the feeling that I was still being watched. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper, as I unlocked the front door and slipped inside. The lobby was warm and quiet, a safe bubble separating me from the dark street outside. I took the stairs two at a time, unwilling to stand still any longer. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me, flipping the bolt twice just to be sure. I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the building, trying to calm my racing heart. But the silence inside felt too complete, too heavy, like the night had followed me in. As I turned to set my keys on the counter, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My scarf, the one I had worn the entire walk home, was draped neatly over the back of a chair. I hadn't taken it off. The campground was tucked deep in the woods, far from the highway and any cell signal. That was the appeal, an escape from everything. I wasn't new to camping. I knew how to set up a tent, build a fire, and enjoy the quiet isolation that came with being surrounded by nature. But this time something felt different. The trees pressed close around the clearing, their branches heavy with shadows as the sun dipped behind the hills. The night settled quickly, faster than I had expected. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the distant rustling of animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful at first, the kind of silence that clears your mind and slows your thoughts. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. The flames flickered, casting the surrounding trees in an eerie orange glow. And there, just inside the tree line, was a man. He stood too still, as if waiting. I stared at him, frozen in place, my heart thudding in my chest. He didn't move closer, didn't make a sound, just stood there, barely visible in the shifting light. I wanted to believe he was just another camper, someone passing through. But something about the way he stood, too patient, too still, sent a ripple of unease through me. He wasn't lost. He wasn't looking for help. He was waiting for something, and I didn't know what. I kept my eyes on him, pretending to tend the fire, trying not to let the fear take over. The air around the campsite felt colder, heavier, as if the fire couldn't reach past its small circle of warmth. Minutes passed, long, unbearable minutes, before he turned and disappeared back into the woods without a word. The silence that followed felt sharper, as if the night had shifted somehow. I sat there, listening to the crackling fire, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But my gut told me otherwise. He hadn't stumbled across my camp by accident. The hours dragged on, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Every sound became sharper, more deliberate. The snap of a branch, the crunch of leaves underfoot. I couldn't tell if it was just the forest or if someone was out there circling the campsite, staying just out of sight. I added more wood to the fire, hoping the light would keep me safe. But the fire, once comforting, now felt like a beacon, a signal marking my location for anyone out there to see. I told myself not to panic, but the knot in my stomach tightened with each passing minute. At some point, I heard it, a sound I couldn't ignore. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the underbrush. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, every muscle tensed. The steps were careful, measured. Not the aimless shuffle of an animal, but the deliberate movements of someone trying not to be noticed. I reached for the hatchet I had packed, my hands slick with sweat. The weight of it in my grip was reassuring, but only just... I told myself that whoever was out there couldn't know I was armed. But the thought gave little comfort. The footsteps stopped, just beyond the firelight. I felt the night pressing in on me, the weight of the darkness thick and suffocating. I gripped the hatchet tighter, trying to steady my breathing. Every instinct told me to stay still, to wait. But the fear gnawed at me, relentless. I scanned the edges of the clearing, hoping, desperately, not to see anything. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper now, impossible to distinguish from one another. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something in the darkness. But it was gone before I could be sure. I sat there for hours, watching the fire die down to embers, too afraid to sleep. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. I could feel the weight of the night around me, pressing in from every direction. I knew I wasn't alone. Even if I couldn't see him, he was out there waiting. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, the relief was overwhelming. The shadows retreated, shrinking back into the corners of the forest. I stood, legs stiff and aching, and began packing my things as quickly as I could. As I gathered my gear, I noticed something, a small pile of rocks, arranged carefully near the edge of the fire pit. They hadn't been there the night before. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine. It was subtle but deliberate, a message. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I packed up the last of my things and left, heading back toward the trailhead without looking back. The forest seemed quieter now, but the silence felt different, more final. Even after I made it back to my car, the unease stayed with me, clinging to me like a shadow. I knew, deep down, that the man hadn't been just a passerby. He had been watching, waiting, and I had no idea what for. And the worst part? I knew he'd be back. I took the house-sitting job without much thought. It seemed like easy money, to stay at a large house on the edge of town for a few nights while the owners were away. I'd done similar jobs before. Feed the cat, water the plants, lock the doors, routine stuff. The house stood at the end of a long driveway, separated from neighbors by thick hedges. It felt isolated, even though the lights from the town shimmered faintly in the distance. I arrived late in the afternoon, lugging my bag up the stone steps. The air smelled faintly of pine, and a strange hush lingered around the property. The owners had left detailed instructions, along with a spare key in a bowl by the front door. I planned to lock the doors, put on a movie, and wait out the night. Simple. For the first few hours, everything was uneventful. The cat curled up on the couch, and the house felt quiet, ordinary. But as night fell, something shifted. The cozy atmosphere seemed to drain, leaving the rooms cold and hollow. I chalked it up to being in a strange place, but the silence clung to me in an odd way, making it hard to relax. The first time the motion lights flicked on in the backyard, I barely reacted. I figured it was the wind or an animal, so I gave it no thought. I peeked through the window, seeing nothing but the empty patio bathed in white light. The trees swayed lazily at the property's edge, but nothing stirred. After a moment, the lights went out, and I returned to my movie. An hour later, the lights snapped on again, and this time the silence felt deliberate. I stood by the window, staring out into the empty backyard. It was too quiet. I tried to tell myself it was a faulty sensor, but the knot of unease tightened in my chest. I locked the back door, checking the handle twice, and turned off the kitchen lights, hoping to shut out the sense of exposure. I barely had time to sit down when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the back door. Just one knock, slow and measured, followed by silence. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. It was the kind of knock that makes you question if you even heard it. I stayed frozen, listening, waiting, but no other sound followed. I forced myself to move toward the window. The backyard was empty, the lights glaring down on the still patio. The air around me grew heavy, like I was being watched from a place just beyond my sight. Then I saw it, a small object lying just outside the door, barely visible in the glow. I squinted to make it out, and my stomach twisted. It was the spare key, the same one I'd checked earlier, still sitting in the bowl by the front door. The realization hit hard. Someone had been inside the house. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the front door, not caring what might still be out there. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a noose. As I reached the door, my heart pounded harder. Then I noticed it, a wet footprint on the welcome mat, glistening under the porch light. I didn't stop. I yanked the door open and ran.